There's a patch of sea about 12 miles off the coast of Kent where the bottom keeps rearranging itself. And on the 29th and 30th of July, 2016, a survey ship spent 2 days there doing something that sounds like the least dramatic job in the world. She ran lines back and forth across an area of just over 2 square miles, sweeping the seabed with multi-beam sonar, logging every square yard of it. Weather was fine. Sea state smooth to moderate. The kind of work that produces a report nobody outside the trade will ever read. The report is 11 pages long. It contains one number that ought to stop you. 25.8 meters, call it 85 feet. That was the shallowest thing the survey found inside that box of water. Now, 85 feet of water sounds like plenty, and in most of the world it would be. The trouble is where that box sits. It lies inside the deep water route northwest of the Sandier Bank. And the deep water route is the corridor that international agreement has set aside for the deepest loaded ships on the planet as they come up the channel and swing northeast for Rotterdam and Antwerp and the German ports. It is, by design, the place the heaviest ships are supposed to go. So here's the second number. In that same year, the automatic tracking data showed that the deepest vessel to pass through that box of water was drawing 23.1 meters, just under 76 feet of steel and cargo below the waterline. And she went by about 160 yards to the northeast of the exact spot where the survey found 85 feet. 160 yards. On a ship 1,300 feet long, that's less than half your own length off to one side. And now the third number, which is the one that turns the first two from a piece of trivia into something with a pulse. The British sailing directions for the Dover Strait carry a recommended underkeel allowance for that particular stretch, and the figure is 6.4 meters, about 21 feet. That figure exists to absorb everything the chart can't tell you in advance, and it's what turns a deep draft transit into a considered act rather than a hopeful one. Add 21 feet of allowance to 76 feet of draft, and you need about 97 feet of water to do the passage properly. The survey found 85. Before that lands harder than it should, let me kill the version of this you're probably already assembling in your head, because it's wrong and the real story is better. Charted depths are measured from a level called chart datum, which is set so low that the tide almost never falls below it. In practice, there's usually more water over that sand wave than the number on the paper. The ship didn't scrape anything. Nobody on her bridge had a bad night. The report doesn't say she was in danger, and neither will I. What the report says in the flat institutional voice these documents always use is that the controlling depth in the area is 3.7 meters, about 12 feet. Shallower than what is considered a critical depth for a vessel of that draft, and that it poses a risk to deep draft vessels passing through the area. And then it says the thing that actually matters. 3 years earlier, in 2013, the surveyors had measured that same sand wave crest. Back then it was 28.5 meters down, about 94 feet. In 3 years, the crest had built up by nearly 3 meters. 9 feet of seabed had arrived, from somewhere, into the one corridor on that stretch of water reserved for the ships with the least room to spare. The surveyors recommended cutting the resurvey interval from 3 years to 2 and extending the box southeast because the sand wave they were most worried about was starting to wander outside the area they were allowed to measure. That's the whole business right there, in one small document about one small piece of the English Channel. The route is fixed, the rules are fixed, the ships are enormous, and getting no smaller. And the floor underneath all of it is moving at a pace you can measure with a stopwatch made of calendars. Let me be straight with you about the word fear, because it's a word that has to be earned. It's a strong claim, and the English Channel is, statistically, one of the safest heavily used waterways anywhere. Ships cross it and transit it hundreds of times a day, every day, and almost nothing happens. That's not an accident, and it isn't luck. And by the time we're done, I want you to understand exactly whose work it is. but something can be safe and frightening at the same time. And to a certain kind of professional, those two things aren't in tension at all. Ask the master of a 1,300-foot container ship what worries him about the Dover Strait, and he isn't going to tell you he's afraid of sinking. He'll tell you something much more specific and much less cinematic, and it will have to do with margins and with how few of them he controls. Let me start with the water, because everything else in this story sits on top of it. If you look at the English Channel on a map, it reads as a gap, a piece of sea between two countries, tapering from a wide western mouth down to a pinch point at the eastern end where Britain nearly touches France. 20.6 miles at the narrowest, from South Foreland just northeast of Dover across to Cap Gris-Nez. About 18 nautical miles. On a properly clear day, you can stand on the cliffs above Dover and see the French coast without help, which is the single most misleading fact about the place because it makes the crossing look like a formality. What the map doesn't show is that the channel is shallow in a specific way that only starts to matter at the scale of modern ships. The average depth in the Strait of Dover is about 46 meters, 150 feet. The deepest point anywhere in the strait, in a trench called the Louwburg Channel, is 68 meters, around 223 feet. To put a human scale on that, the deepest water in the busiest strait on Earth is roughly the height of a 20-story building, and the average is less than half of that. Now put a modern ship into it. A ship like MSC Arena or Ever a Lot, or any of the giants delivered over the last few years, runs to about 1,300 feet long and around 200 feet across the beam. Loaded down to her marks, a ship of that class puts a substantial slab of herself below the surface, and the deepest ships in these waters aren't even the container ships. They're the tankers and the bulk carriers heading for the deepest berths at Rotterdam. And they're the ones that show up in the survey data drawing 75 and 76 feet. So the picture you want in your head is of a very large, very heavy object being driven along a corridor where the floor sits closer than most people assume, in company with several hundred other objects doing the same thing, in a place where the water level itself rises and falls like a slow tide gate. Because it does. That's the next piece. The tidal range at Dover is not gentle. Take a real day, one we'll come back to later for other reasons. On the 18th of September 2013, low water at Dover was predicted at 1.1 meters, about 3.5 feet, and high water at 6.7 meters, about 22 feet. That's a rise of 5.6 meters, about 18 feet, in a little over 4.5 hours. 18 feet of sea level, arriving and leaving twice a day, every day, in the strait where the deepest ships in the world have 21 feet of recommended clearance. Which means depth in the Dover Strait belongs to a place and a time together. Asking how deep it is gets you nowhere. The only useful question is how deep it is right now, and how deep it'll be in 90 minutes when you actually get there. And the tide doesn't just go up and down. It runs. Water shifting that much has to come from somewhere and go somewhere. And in the strait, it moves as a stream that reverses roughly every 6 hours. Off South Foreland, a few miles out, the east-going stream runs at about 2.5 knots on a spring tide, and the west-going stream at a shade over 2. That doesn't sound like much until you remember what it's doing to a ship trying to hold a line across it, or to a ferry trying to cross the flow at right angles, or to a small boat that has decided the gap in the traffic looks bigger than it is. 2.5 knots of stream on the beam is the difference between the course you're steering and the course you're making good. It's the reason a ship can point in exactly the right direction and still slide sideways towards something she has no business being near. And then there are the banks. This is where the channel stops being a gap between two countries and starts being a piece of terrain. The Strait of Dover has a floor with topography, and some of that topography comes shockingly close to the surface. The most famous piece of it is a long, thin ridge of sand called the Varn, sitting about 9 miles south-west of Dover. It runs for nearly 6 miles, it's less than 1/4 of a mile wide in places, and the shallowest part of it has around 2 meters of water over it at chart datum, 6.5 feet. And in the middle of the busiest shipping lane on Earth, there is a sandbank you could stand on at low water and get wet somewhere around your collarbone. Trinity House marks it with lighted buoys at the north, south, east, and west ends, and there's been some kind of manned or automatic light float sitting on it since 1860, for the very plain reason that ships kept finding it. A little to the southeast, there's another ridge the French call Le Colbar, and the British charts call the Ridge. Further northeast, the Sandetier. And off the East Kent coast, the Goodwin Sands, which are their own kind of nightmare, about 10 miles long, 1 to 2 miles wide, running from roughly half a meter above the low water mark, 1.5 feet, down to about 3 meters below it. Call it 10 feet. Parts of the Goodwins dry out. You can, on the right tide, walk on them. People have played cricket on them, which is exactly the sort of thing that happens when a nation with a lot of coastline gets bored. More than 2,000 ships are known to have been lost on the Goodwins, and the true number is certainly higher because a great many wrecks in the age of sail were never recorded at all. They earned a nickname, the Ship Swallower, and it's one of the few pieces of maritime folklore that's literally true rather than just atmospheric. The sand moves. Wrecks get buried, then uncovered, then buried again. The warship Stirling Castle went down there in the Great Storm of 1703, disappeared completely, and came back out from under a sandbank in 1979 in a state of preservation that startled the archaeologists. She's been appearing and disappearing ever since on a schedule nobody sets. Remember that moving sand? It comes back. Now, the professional response to all this is not superstition, it's arithmetic. And the arithmetic is where you start to see what the job actually feels like from the inside. Every deep draft ship coming through the strait has to answer one question before she gets there. How much water will actually be under the keel at the moment of passage? The chart's number is only the starting point. What counts is how much will really be there. On the day, at the hour, at the speed she'll be doing. The British guidance on this is refreshingly blunt about how many ways that sum can go wrong. Masters planning a passage through the Dover Strait are told to make allowance for the effects of squat at the passage speed, for uncertainties in charted depths and tide levels, and for the effects of waves and swell resulting from local and distant storms. 4 separate sources of error, stacked, and each one deserves a moment. Squat first, because it's the one that surprises people who've never handled a big ship. When a vessel moves through shallow water, the water she displaces has to squeeze between her hull and the seabed, and it has to move faster to get out of the way. Faster water is lower pressure water. Lower pressure under the hull means the whole ship settles bodily downwards and usually trims by the head or the stern as she does it. She sinks with no water coming aboard at all, purely because the water underneath her can't get out of the way fast enough. It's the same effect that makes a car feel light over a crest, running in reverse, and it scales viciously with speed. For a very large vessel moving at a decent clip through confined water, squat can run to 5 or 6 feet. That's 5 or 6 feet of draft that wasn't there when you did the sums in port, appearing purely because you're going too fast. Every experienced ship handler knows this. It's in the textbooks, it's in the training, it's on the wall of every pilot's office in Europe. And it still catches people, because the correction is counterintuitive under pressure. When you're worried about the bottom, the instinct is to get across the shallow patch quickly, and the correct response is to slow down. Second source of error, the tide levels themselves. And here the guidance contains a line that I think is one of the quietly alarming sentences in the whole regulatory literature of the strait. When calculating the depth of water, mariners are reminded that the height of the tide in mid-strait can be up to 1 meter less than predicted for the adjacent standard port. Read that again. The tidal prediction, the number you looked up, the number your passage plan is built on, can be out by a meter, 3 and a bit feet, Not because anybody made a mistake, but because tide tables are computed for standard ports on the coast, and the middle of the strait is not a port. It's a place where the tide arriving from the Atlantic through the Channel meets the tide swinging round the top of Scotland and down into the North Sea. And the interference pattern between those two systems does things that a coastal prediction can't fully capture. So of your 21 feet of recommended allowance, 3 feet can vanish before you've done anything at all. Third, uncertainties in charted depths. That one puts us straight back on top of that survey report. Charts are as good as the last time somebody looked, and in a sand wave field, the last time somebody looked can be a long time ago in seabed terms. Fourth, waves and swell from local and distant storms. A ship pitching and rolling in a seaway isn't sitting at a constant draft. She's oscillating. The lowest point of the roll is the number that matters, and swell generated by a storm hundreds of miles away out in the Atlantic can arrive in the channel as a long, low, almost invisible undulation that a ship rides without anybody on the bridge thinking much of it, while the bottom of her hull describes an arc several feet deep. Stack those four together: squat, tidal error, chart uncertainty, wave motion. That's what the 21 feet is for. It isn't padding. It's the sum of four things you cannot see and cannot fully predict. And it's why the deep draft corridor exists in the first place. There's a version of this story where that's simply prudent engineering, and everybody goes home. And for the overwhelming majority of transits, that's exactly what it is. But I want you to notice something about the structure of it, because it's going to matter later. Every one of those four allowances is calculated in advance by a person, using information that was accurate when it was gathered. The ship then goes and executes the plan. And if any part of the plan was wrong, the ship has no independent way of finding out until she's in the water the plan sent her into. That's the water thread. Shallow, tidal, moving, imperfectly known, and unforgiving of arithmetic errors. Now let's talk about the traffic, because on its own, the water explains almost nothing. Here's a way to feel the traffic before we count it. Stand on the cliffs above Dover on any ordinary afternoon and look southeast. There is never a moment when the horizon is empty. There is never a moment when you can see one ship. What you see is a procession, several miles out, moving right to left in an unbroken line, and beyond it, further out and slightly hazier, a second procession moving left to right, and cutting across both of them, at what looks like a suicidal angle, the ferries. That's the Dover Strait. Two rivers of steel flowing in opposite directions, with a third stream of traffic crossing both at 90 degrees all day and all night, in a channel 20 miles wide. The numbers depend on who's counting and what they count, and the differences are worth understanding rather than smoothing over. The British Coast Guard describes over 400 commercial vessels transiting daily, plus more than 100 cross-channel freight and passenger ferry movements each day. French figures for the traffic separation scheme run to around 90,000 ships a year in both directions, averaging about 250 a day. In 2006, the French recorded 59,674 ships in the northeast-bound lane alone, which works out at roughly 163 a day going one way. Those figures aren't in conflict. They're measuring different boxes on the map, different tonnage thresholds, different definitions of what counts as a transit, but whichever set you take, the shape is the same. Every single day, somewhere between 250 and 500 commercial ships thread a gap 20 miles wide, and roughly 100 more cross their path at right angles. And that crossing traffic is not a rounding error. The Port of Dover is the busiest international ferry port in the United Kingdom and handles more lorries than every other British port combined. Roughly 2.1 million freight vehicles a year go through it. Around a third of all Britain's trade in goods with the European Union crosses that 20-mile gap on a ship, and the ferries run 24 hours a day, 364 days a year, with a departure on average every half hour. That last detail deserves a second of your attention. Every half hour, around the clock, a large, fast vessel loaded with people and trucks leaves Dover or Calais and drives straight across the busiest shipping lane on the planet, and does it in about 90 minutes, and does it again and again. And this has been utterly routine for decades. Nobody thinks about it. Nobody in Kent stands at the window watching the ferry go and thinks about the geometry. It has become invisible in the way that only well-solved problems become invisible. It was not always invisible. Go back to the early 1960s, and the channel was a free-for-all in the most literal sense. There were no lanes. There was no scheme. There was a body of collision regulations, the rules of the road at sea, which told you what to do when you met another vessel. And beyond that, every master picked his own line through. If the shortest route to your destination happened to run against the general flow, you took it. That was legal. That was normal. And the casualty statistics were getting ugly. In 1963, the Liverpool Underwriters Association reported 21 collisions that had caused total losses of ships, against a 5-year average of just under 14. A report on tanker hazards presented to the United States Treasury late that same year concluded that most accidents came down to human error, with speed in congested waters as a principal cause. The report noted that there were too many diverse rules of the road, that the width of navigable channels had generally not kept pace with the increase in the size of ships, and that not enough was being done with modern communications. I find that last list quietly extraordinary because it was written more than 60 years ago and every item on it is still recognizably the problem. Ships got bigger, faster than the water got wider. Everybody has rules, and not everybody has the same ones. And the communications technology keeps arriving faster than the habits that would make it safe. At the same time, the Institutes of Navigation of West Germany, France, and the United Kingdom had started working together on the problem, and they came up with an idea that now seems so obvious, it's hard to believe it needed inventing. If congested water behaves like a congested road, then run it like a road. Put the northbound traffic on one side, the southbound on the other, and keep a strip of empty water down the middle so that a mistake by one ship doesn't immediately become a mistake shared with the ship coming the other way. One-way streets at sea. They weren't working blind either. Separated traffic lanes of that type were already in use on the Great Lakes of North America. The pieces existed. What the institutes did was see that the pieces applied to the English Channel. The proposals landed well at what was then called IMCO and is now the International Maritime Organization. And in June of 1967, a traffic separation scheme was established in the Dover Strait. The first anywhere in the world. 2 lanes and a separation zone between them, laid out on a chart of a piece of open sea with nothing physical marking any of it. No paint, no barriers. Just an agreement and a line on paper and a general expectation that professional mariners would behave professionally. And it worked. The record shows a significant fall in collisions between ships on opposing courses, which is precisely the class of accident the scheme was designed to prevent, and precisely the class of accident that tends to kill people, because 2 vessels closing head-on close at the sum of their speeds. Let me be precise about what that proves, because the temptation to overclaim is enormous, and the honest version is more interesting. It's easy to say that the scheme caused the fall. What the evidence supports is narrower and still remarkable. The scheme was introduced, and the specific category of collision it targeted declined. Other things were changing too. Radar was spreading, training was improving, but the pattern of the decline, concentrated in head-on encounters, points hard at the lanes. There was one enormous flaw, though, and it was baked into the design from the first day. Observance was voluntary. The scheme existed. The lanes were on the charts. And a master who decided that the scheme was for other people, that his own passage was shorter along the English coast against the flow, that he knew this water and had done it for years, could simply do it. There was nothing anybody could do about it beyond the general obligations of the collision regulations, which is to say, nothing. For 4 years, the Dover Strait ran on the good faith of its users. Then came January of 1971. On the 11th of January, 1971, the Panamanian registered tanker Texaco Caribbean was in the Dover Strait, in ballast off the Varne. Visibility was very poor. Thick fog, the classic channel condition, the one that has shaped the collision record of this water for as long as anybody has kept records. She was struck by the Peruvian freighter Paracas, which by the accounts of the time was running against the flow along the English coast. Taking the shorter way? Doing the thing that the voluntary scheme asked ships not to do and had no power to stop. The tanker was destroyed. She broke apart and sank, and around 600 metric tons of bunker fuel went into the strait with her. 22 of her crew were rescued, 8 were not. That by itself would have been a serious maritime accident and a bad day. What happened next is the reason people still talk about it. The wreck of the Texaco Caribbean was now lying on the bottom, in the traffic, in the fog, and the wreck marking arrangements of the day were slower than the situation demanded. The following night, the West German freighter Brandenburg came through and struck the submerged remains. She sank quickly. Reports of the time put her losses at 21 of her 32 crew. 2 ships down in 2 nights in the same spot, in the middle of the world's busiest strait. And then, about 6 weeks later, on the 27th of February, the Greek freighter Niki came through the same water and struck the same wreckage and went down with all 21 people aboard. 3 ships, 1 patch of sea, weeks apart. I've read a fair amount of maritime accident material, and there's a particular flavor of horror to this one that has nothing to do with the details of any individual sinking. It's the repetition. It's the fact that the seafloor of the Dover Strait had acquired a hazard, and the system for telling ships about it operated more slowly than the traffic did, and the traffic kept coming, because the traffic always keeps coming. There is no pause button on a trade route. The reaction was immediate and, by the standards of international regulation, astonishingly fast. In March of 1971, 2 months after the first collision, the International Maritime Organization's Maritime Safety Committee recommended that observance of all traffic separation schemes be made mandatory. The IMO Assembly adopted that recommendation later the same year. The Dover Strait scheme became the first mandatory traffic separation scheme in the world. And the following year, in 1972, the conference that produced the modern collision regulations built the obligation into international law as Rule 10. Rule 10 is short, and few paragraphs ever written about the sea have done as much work. It says, in effect, if there's a scheme, use it. Go with the flow of the lane you're in. Join and leave at the ends where you can, and if you have to join at the side, do it at a shallow angle. If you have to cross on a heading as nearly as practicable at right angles to the flow. Stay out of the separation zone. And if you're a small vessel or a sailing vessel or a fishing vessel, keep out of the way of everything that's following the lane. At the same moment in 1972, the other half of the answer arrived. The Channel Navigation Information Service opened, and this is the piece that changes the whole character of the story, because up to this point, everything we've described has been rules on paper. From 1972, there were eyes. The service is jointly run by Britain and France. The British side operates from Dover, watching the southwest-bound lane, the one that runs along the English coast. The French side operates from Cap Gris-Nez, watching the northeast-bound lane along the French side. radar and, in the modern era, automatic identification signals from the ships themselves, feeding a set of displays where every vessel in the strait shows up as a symbol with a name attached and a little line projecting ahead of it, showing where she'll be in a few minutes. It's a 24-hour radio and radar safety service for all shipping in the strait, and it has been running continuously for more than half a century. Since 1999, there's also been a mandatory reporting requirement, with the excellent name CalDovrep. And if you want to understand the mindset of the place, look at what a ship has to tell them: name, call sign, identification numbers, position, course, speed, draft, the route she intends to take, details of any hazardous cargo, and any defects in her structure or her equipment. Any defects before you enter. That's the sentence that tells you what everybody involved is actually worried about. Ships heading northeast report to the French 2 miles before they cross the boundary. Ships heading southwest report to the British as they come into radio range of North Foreland. Every vessel over 300 gross tons, which is to say almost anything commercial, checks in before entering the busiest strait on Earth and says who she is and how deep she's sitting and whether anything on board is broken. And the shoreside talks back. There's a routine broadcast every hour on the marine radio, giving the traffic picture and anything unusual. And if visibility drops below 2 miles, the broadcast interval halves to every 30 minutes, because when nobody can see, the value of somebody who can goes up. There are also inshore traffic zones along both coasts, the strips of water between the lanes and the shore. Those are reserved for small vessels under 20 meters, about 65 feet, sailing vessels, fishing vessels, and anything actually going to or from a port or an offshore installation. And the guidance is very firm on the one point that everybody wants to argue about. Heavy traffic and poor visibility are explicitly not sufficient reasons to duck into the inshore zone. You don't get to leave the lane because the lane is busy. The lane being busy is the entire point of the lane. Finally, there's enforcement, and it has teeth. The radar and the identification data get recorded. Evidence gets collected in real time. A vessel that contravenes the collision regulations gets reported to her flag state, and if she turns up in a British port, she can be prosecuted. People assume this is theoretical. It isn't. In one recent case, a skipper who took a day-angling boat the wrong way along the southwest-bound lane on several occasions in September of 2022 ended up at Maidstone Magistrates Court, where the fine itself was modest at around £1,700, and the prosecution costs came to $25,000. Going the wrong way up the Dover Strait is one of those offenses where the punishment isn't the fine. The punishment is the lawyer. So that's the machine. Lanes, a separation zone, inshore zones, a right-angle crossing rule, mandatory reporting, 24-hour radar surveillance from 2 countries, hourly broadcasts, and a prosecution service at the end of it. And by any reasonable measure, it is one of the great successes of maritime engineering. Engineering of the behavioral kind. Take a system with hundreds of independent actors, no central control, no physical constraints, and a lethal failure mode, and redesign the behavior until the failures mostly stop. Which they did. And this is the point where I have to tread carefully, because the record does not support the version of this story that would be easiest to tell. The easy version goes like this. Busiest strait in the world? Ships getting bigger every year? Traffic climbing? Disaster inevitable? A catastrophe waiting to happen? It writes itself. It's also, on the evidence, wrong. And I'd rather give you the awkward truth because the awkward truth is where the fear actually lives. In 2003, there was a small and rather pointed exchange in the pages of the Journal of Navigation, the House Journal of the Royal Institute of Navigation, which is where this sort of argument gets settled in Britain. A paper had been published on the hazards of navigating the Dover Strait scheme. He being been to drawing on the experience of working mariners, and it argued, among other things, that ferry traffic crossing the strait might have increased by as much as 71% since 1972. That is a big claim, and it got answered by A.N. Cockcroft, who had done a great deal of the original research on Dover Strait collision statistics, and who is, in navigational circles, roughly the last word on the subject. His correction is a small masterpiece of quiet demolition. The 71% figure rested on a reading of a 1972 survey by the National Physical Laboratory, which was taken to show about 70 ferry crossings a day in both directions combined. Cockcroft pointed out that the diagrams in the original paper make it clear the actual figure was 70 a day in each direction. And he added a second data point. An Anglo-French survey of Dover Strait traffic in 1977 found 187 crossing movements a day, around 80% of them ferries, which means the available evidence does not indicate any significant increase in crossing traffic since the 1970s. The ferries have got bigger and faster. There aren't dramatically more of them. Then he went after the collision numbers too. There was a widely repeated claim that a study by the International Association of Institutes of Navigation showed 60 collisions in the Dover Strait between 1956 and 1960, against only 16 in the 20 years since the separation scheme came in. Cockcroft, who produced the underlying research, pointed out that the 16 collisions were not a 20-year figure at all. They covered 5 years, from 1976 to 1980 inclusive, and he gave the modern comparison. 13 collisions in the 3-year period, from 1999 to 2001, with the year 2001 looking unusually bad. That figure cuts both ways, and it needs to. On one hand, the terrifying version of the story falls apart. The scheme has held. Traffic did not explode. The collision rate has not run away. The available data does not show a significant increase since the early years of traffic separation. On the other hand, 13 collisions in 3 years is not zero. This water still produces contact between ships at a rate of roughly 4 a year in the period he examined, and every one of those has a bridge team on it who did not intend to be part of a statistic. There's a version of documentary storytelling that would call that reassuring, and a version that would call it damning, and both would be cheating. What it is a maintained equilibrium. Somebody is holding this number down. It doesn't stay low on its own. And that's the point I want to plant now and come back to at the end, because it's the load-bearing idea in the whole thing. The low casualty rate in the Dover Strait is the achievement. It is the output of the machine, not the natural state of the water. Every day the number stays low. That is a result being produced by radar operators and passage planners and surveyors and buoy tenders and rule makers, and above all, by several thousand watch-keeping officers who did their job properly on a night when nobody was watching. Read the safety record and conclude that the fear is unfounded, and you've drawn precisely the wrong lesson. You've mistaken the scaffolding for the building. The professionals who work this water are not afraid, because the strait is dangerous, in the way a cliff edge is dangerous. They're afraid because they know exactly how much continuous effort goes into making it look like it isn't. Now, one more thing about that collision record before we move on, because there's a condition attached to almost all of it: fog. The Dover Strait fogs in. It fogs in more than most people who've never worked there imagine. Late autumn and winter bring the classic thick stuff, and there's a second season in late spring and early summer when warm air moves over water that's still cold from the winter and lays a sheet of sea fog across the strait that can reduce visibility to a few hundred yards in the space of half an hour on a day that started blue. The Texaco Caribbean was struck in thick fog. The historical collision record of the strait leans heavily on periods of reduced visibility, so much so that the Coast Guard's broadcast schedule is written around it. The moment visibility drops below 2 miles, the traffic broadcasts double in frequency. Here is what fog does that people underestimate. Everybody assumes the problem is not being able to see. Radar handles that reasonably well and has done for 70 years, and the automatic identification system now puts a name and a course and a speed next to every significant target on the screen. In pure information terms, a modern bridge in fog knows a great deal. The problem fog creates is different, and worse. It removes the shared picture. In clear weather, two ships approaching each other can each see the other's lights, and crucially, each knows the other can see hers. There's an implicit conversation happening. That green side light coming into view means the other vessel has altered to starboard, and it means she meant you to see it. Take that away, and you have two bridge teams building separate mental models of the same situation, each confident, each unable to confirm anything, each having to guess what the other has understood. That is the exact failure mode that produces collisions in this strait, and keep it somewhere handy, because in a few minutes, I'm going to show you it happening on a perfectly clear night with excellent visibility, between two ships that could see each other the whole time, and it will make more sense than it has any right to. But first, the crossing traffic, because the geometry of the Dover Strait contains a problem that the lanes did not solve and could not solve, and it's the one that makes professional mariners uneasy in a way the depth never quite does. Picture a ferry leaving Dover for Calais. She's a big ship in her own right, several hundred feet long, carrying a few hundred people and a hold full of articulated lorries. And she's on a schedule that the entire logistics chain of two countries is built around. She clears the harbor entrance and turns southeast, and immediately she is standing in the road. Not metaphorically. The traffic separation scheme runs across her route, both lanes of it, and there is no bridge over it and no tunnel through it, at least none she can use. To get to France, she has to cross the southwest-bound lane, then the separation zone, then the northeast-bound lane, and then do the whole thing in reverse on the way home, roughly 100 times a day between all the operators in both directions forever. The collision regulations tell her how. Rule 10 says a vessel crossing a traffic lane shall do so on a heading as nearly as practicable at right angles to the general direction of traffic flow. That word practicable is doing an enormous amount of work, and the reasoning behind the rule is worth understanding because the logic of it is elegant. Crossing at right angles feels wrong to a navigator. It's the longest exposure to the lane, and the natural instinct is to angle across, cutting the corner, spending less time in the traffic. The rule says no, and the reason is that a right angle crossing makes you legible. A ship approaching down the lane sees your side. Your aspect changes fast and unambiguously. Your intentions are obvious to anyone with eyes or radar. Angle across the lane and you become a vessel on a slowly converging course, which is the single most difficult situation in all of collision avoidance, because a slowly changing bearing is very hard to distinguish from a bearing that isn't changing at all. And a bearing that isn't changing means you're going to hit. So the rule sacrifices efficiency for clarity. The ferry spends longer in the lane and makes it obvious what she's doing while she's there. And it works. And it has worked for 50 years. And the ferry crossing at Dover is one of the more reliable pieces of transport infrastructure in Europe. But look at what that means for the ships in the lane. You are the officer of the watch on a container ship coming down the southwest lane at 15 knots. You have vessels ahead of you and vessels behind you and vessels on either side of you, all going roughly your way at a spread of speeds, which means you are permanently in some stage of an overtaking situation with somebody. And crossing your path from the left, at right angles, at more than 20 knots, is a stream of high-speed passenger ships that have somewhere to be. Now add the fishing vessels. The channel is a working fishery and always has been, and fishing boats have rights and obligations that are different from everybody else's. A vessel engaged in fishing shall not impede the passage of any vessel following a traffic lane, which is clear enough as a principle and considerably less clear at 3 in the morning when a trawler is towing gear and can't maneuver freely and the lane is full. Add the small craft. Yachts cross the strait constantly in the summer. They're required to cross at right angles too, and the sailing organizations have produced a great deal of sensible guidance about it. And most of them do it properly. Most. And add everything else. Offshore supply vessels working on cables and installations, survey ships, dredgers, naval vessels, pilot boats running out and back, and search and rescue traffic, because this is water where people get into trouble in small boats. And the Coast Guard operations room that watches the shipping is the same operations room that answers when somebody is in the water. That last point deserves a moment, because it's where the abstraction of a traffic scheme meets the reality of a shift. When the accident investigators looked at the Dover Coast Guard watch in detail, they set out what the duty watch is actually responsible for. 4 key functions. The Channel Navigation Information Service, watching the strait. The Sunk Vessel Traffic Service, covering a separate area in the North Sea approaches. Continuous monitoring of the international distress frequency. And search and rescue. 4 jobs, 1 room, simultaneously, round the clock. The minimum was 4 qualified operators on watch at any time, with a policy of 6 on day watches and 5 at night, including trainees. And the investigators found something that will be familiar to anybody who has ever worked in a public service that runs continuously. Manpower shortfalls meant the duty watch was frequently unable to meet its commitments without pulling in operators from their days off. It was commonplace for staff to work overtime on other watches simply to keep minimum manning. Local managers had reported the risk up the chain. The response had not fixed it. I'm not going to pretend to neutrality on that. A room where 4 people simultaneously run the busiest strait on Earth, a second traffic service, the distress watch and search and rescue, at minimum manning, sustained by voluntary overtime, is a room where the safety margin is somebody's goodwill. That works right up until the day it doesn't. And there's one more category of traffic in the lanes that changes the arithmetic for everybody. And it's the reason we keep circling back to depth. The collision regulations contain a category called a vessel constrained by her draft. It applies to a power-driven vessel which, because of her draft, in relation to the available depth and width of navigable water, is severely restricted in her ability to deviate from the course she is following. She marks herself. 3 all-round red lights in a vertical line at night, or a black cylinder by day. And the rules require most other vessels to avoid impeding her safe passage. Think about what that signal actually communicates. It says, "I cannot turn." It means something harder than awkward and something worse than a delay, because the water either side of my track is too shallow for me. And if you put me in a position where I have to alter course substantially, you have not created an inconvenience. You have created a grounding. That is a modern megaship in the Dover Strait deepwater route on a bad day. 1,300 feet long, 70-odd feet of draft, in a corridor she was funneled into precisely because she can't go anywhere else, surrounded by traffic that can, with an alarm and a rule book and a radar operator ashore as the whole of her defense against somebody else's mistake. And she cannot stop. That's the part people outside the industry consistently fail to internalize. A loaded ship of that size, at a normal service speed, needs a distance measured in miles to come to a halt, and she has almost no ability to slow down quickly without losing steerage, because a ship steers by, pushing water past her rudder. Take the power off, and you lose the helm. The 2 things you most want in an emergency, which are to slow down and to turn, are in direct competition with each other. So the fear starts to take a shape, and it has less to do with depth alone or traffic alone than with the way those 2 things keep arriving in the same minute. Before I show you how that happens, I want you to meet some of the people it happens to, because this story has been abstract for long enough and the Dover Strait is not run by systems. It's run by individuals doing specific physical tasks in the dark. Start with the pilot. If a very large ship is coming up the channel bound for the northern European ports, there's a decent chance she'll take a deep-sea pilot. These are self-employed professionals, licensed annually on behalf of the British government by Trinity House. And they're a different animal from the harbor pilots most people have vaguely heard of. A harbor pilot comes aboard for the last few miles and takes you to the berth. A deep-sea pilot joins on the approach to the English Channel and stays with the ship through her entire northern European rotation, through the Strait, into the Dutch and Belgian and German ports and back out again, sometimes for weeks. They board by launch at Brixham, on the Devon coast, or at Cherbourg on the French side. The International Maritime Organization recommends the use of properly licensed deep-sea pilots in the North Sea, the English Channel, and the Skagerrak. Recommends, not requires. That's worth stopping on. There is no compulsory pilotage for the Dover Strait itself. A 1,300-foot ship with a crew who have never seen these waters before can transit the busiest strait in the world entirely on her own resources, legally. With nobody aboard who has local knowledge, provided she reports in and follows the rules. It happens every day. It is completely normal. Whether that's the right arrangement is an argument that has been running for as long as the scheme has existed, and I'll admit I find the case for the current setup less obvious than the industry generally does. But the practical effect is this: the local expertise is available, and taking it is a commercial decision made by an owner in an office somewhere. Now the boarding itself, because this is where the reality of the job stops being administrative. To get a pilot onto a ship at sea, the ship rigs a rope ladder over the side. Wooden steps, side ropes, hung from the deck down to the water. The pilot boat comes alongside a moving ship matching her speed, and the pilot steps from a small vessel that is pitching and rolling onto a ladder hanging off a large vessel that is moving, and climbs. In the dark. In whatever weather there is. Wearing a life jacket. Over water that in the channel in winter is cold enough to disable a person in minutes. This is not a legacy practice waiting to be modernized. It's how it's done, today, on every large ship in the world, and the arrangements are governed by detailed international requirements about how the ladder is built, how it's secured, how it's lit, how the handholds are set up. The International Maritime Pilots Association runs a safety campaign where working pilots report what they actually find when they arrive at the ship's side. In their 2023 campaign, 16% of pilot transfer arrangements were found to be defective, and half of those defects were about how the ladder had been rigged. An earlier survey found much higher rates, around a quarter of pilot ladders and 2/5 of combination arrangements reported as non-compliant, with the commonest problems being ladders not properly secured, badly rigged retrieval lines, faulty handhold stanchions, and steps that weren't horizontal. In the United Kingdom alone, in many consiste, the competent harbor authorities reported something like 96,000 pilot transfers in 2022, and more than 400 incidents or accidents arising from them, and pilots have died doing it. A Sandy Hook pilot with more than 35 years of experience was killed in a fall while boarding a container ship at the end of 2019. A pilot with more than 20 years in the job was killed transferring to a vessel in the Humber in January of 2023. Every one of these produces an investigation, and the investigations keep finding the same handful of failures in equipment that costs almost nothing to maintain properly. I bring this up here for a reason that goes beyond sympathy. Consider what the ladder tells you about the whole system. The most sophisticated ships ever built, carrying 250,000 metric tons, navigated by satellite, monitored by shore radar, insured for hundreds of millions, and the transfer of the one person aboard who knows the local water is accomplished by a human being climbing a rope ladder up the side of a moving ship in the dark, and roughly 1 time in 6 the ladder isn't right. That gap between the grandeur of the machinery and the fragility of the human interfaces holding it together runs through everything in this story. You'll see it again in a minute in a very different form. Now the bridge. Here's what a lot of people picture: a large team, several officers, a helmsman, lookouts, everybody at stations, the whole ship alert for the passage of a difficult strait. Here's what's often actually there at 3 in the morning. One officer of the watch, one rating as lookout, who may have been sent to fetch something. The master, asleep in his cabin one deck below, on call. That's a legal, normal, properly certificated watch on a very large ship in the busiest strait in the world. The officer is standing a 4-hour watch, then 8 hours off, then 4 on again, a rhythm that never lets you take a full night's sleep and that continues for months. He's probably on a contract of 6 to 9 months without going home. He's likely working in his second or third language, on a ship where the working language might be a fourth, talking on the radio to people from a dozen other countries doing the same. And on top of navigating, he's got the mandatory reporting to file, the routine broadcasts to monitor, the alarms to acknowledge, the paperwork the shore office wants, and the constant low-grade demand of a strait where something is always developing somewhere. This is not a complaint about the industry. It's a description of the conditions in which the safety record we talked about earlier gets produced. When the accident reports say fatigue was probably a factor, this is the shape of the fatigue, and it's the environment into which the strait quietly introduces its own particular trap, which is the point where the water and the traffic finally stop being separate problems. The deep water route is what happens when you try to solve the depth problem and the traffic problem with the same instrument. Here's the logic. Most ships in the northeast-bound lane can go more or less where they like within it because the general depths are ample for them. A ferry, a coaster, a mid-sized container ship, a car carrier. They've got tens of feet of water under them everywhere in the lane, and the bottom is somebody else's problem. But the deepest vessels have a much smaller set of options, and those options need to be known in advance, marked on the chart, and kept clear. So the routing system carved out a specific track. The deep water route northwest of the Sandier Bank is intended for use by vessels with a draft of 16 meters or more, which is about 53 feet. Everybody else is asked to keep out of it where practicable, partly to leave it clear, and partly because it runs close to the southwest-bound traffic on the other side. And there's a further recommendation attached to deep water routes generally that tells you a great deal about the mindset. Vessels using them are advised to avoid overtaking. Think about what that combination produces. You are in the deepest corridor because you have to be. You've been asked not to overtake because there isn't room to do it safely. And if the ship ahead of you is slower than you'd like, you stay behind her, at her speed, in her wake, for as long as it takes. You have been placed in a queue, in a lane, over a specific piece of seabed, because of your draft. Now here's what's happening to that piece of seabed. The route crosses a sand wave field. Sand waves are exactly what they sound like, ridges of sand on the seafloor, built by the current arranged in ranks. In this field, they run on an alignment of roughly 145 degrees to 325 degrees, which puts their crests across the general lie of the route, and they range from 2 to 10 meters high, 6 feet to 33 feet of relief on the bottom, formed by nothing more exotic than water pushing sand around. And they migrate. If you've ever seen aerial photography of a desert, you've seen the same physics. Crescent dunes in the Sahara or the Namib march downwind at rates you can measure in feet per year. And there are roads and railways and towns in North Africa and the Middle East that spend real money every year on the simple, undignified business of getting the dune off the infrastructure. The dune is not malicious. It's just a pile of loose material in a moving fluid. And a pile of loose material in a moving fluid goes where the fluid tells it. The floor of the Dover Strait approaches is a desert with the wind turned to water, and the tide is a wind that reverses twice a day and still, over years, has a net preference, which is why the survey numbers read the way they do. In 2013, the surveyors ran the area and found a controlling depth of 28.5 meters, about 94 feet, and they noted a particular sand wave migrating south by about 100 feet. They recommended creating a smaller, focused survey area covering everywhere the depths were under 30 meters, a bit under 100 feet, on a 3-year cycle. At that time, the calculation looked like this. Assume a maximum draft of 22.6 meters, about 74 feet, for the Europort trade, which was a reasonable working figure for the deepest ships bound for Rotterdam. Apply the recommended under-keel allowance of 6.4 meters. That gives you a critical depth of about 29 meters for the route, which is 95 feet. The survey found 28.5. Already, in 2013, the shallowest point in the deep water corridor was 0.5 meter, 1.5 feet, under the figure the planning assumption called for. 3 years later, they came back, and the picture had changed in a way the previous report hadn't predicted. Sand waves in the southern half of the area had advanced up to 80 meters to the northeast, which is about 260 feet of dune movement in 36 months, and that movement decreased toward the northeast of the area and actually reversed at the eastern edge, running back to the south-southwest. The report notes, almost apologetically, that this contrasts with the general southward migration observed in the previous survey. The seabed had changed its mind. Meanwhile, the sand wave that had held the controlling depth in 2013 had moved about 65 feet south-southwest, having moved up to 150 feet in the 3 years before that, and its crest had come up slightly to 28.1 meters, about 92 feet. But it no longer mattered, because something else had overtaken it. Further northeast, where the sand waves were more stationary, sand had simply been piling up, and that spot, which in 2013 had measured 28.6 meters, about 94 feet, now measured 25.8, 2.8 meters shallower, 9 feet of new seabed in 3 years in the deep water route. Then the report does the arithmetic that gave us our opening. The largest draft recorded in the area that year was 23.1 meters, just under 76 feet. Apply the same allowance, and the critical depth for a ship like that is 29.5 meters, about 97 feet. The controlling depth was 3.7 meters, roughly 12 feet, less than that. And the recommendations follow with a certain grim logic. Cut the resurvey interval from 3 years to 2. Extend the survey box to the southeast, because the largest sand wave in the area is now growing out beyond the limits of the area they're permitted to measure, and it's close to the recommended track for deep draft vessels. That last one is the sentence I keep coming back to. The most important feature in the survey was leaving the survey. Nobody did anything wrong. The boundaries of a survey area are drawn by people, and the sand doesn't have the boundaries. So let's put the two threads together, because this is the point where they stop being separate stories. Thread 1 was the water. Shallow strait, big tidal range, unreliable tidal prediction in the middle, squat, swell, and a seabed that moves faster than the survey cycle. Thread 2 was the traffic. Several hundred ships a day, 100 more crossing at right angles. A mandatory scheme that works because everybody stays in their lane, and a rule structure that specifically tells the biggest ships they cannot deviate. Here's the join. The traffic system's answer to the depth problem is to put the deepest ships in a fixed corridor and ask everyone else to stay out of it. That's a good answer. It's probably the only workable answer, but it converts a navigational choice into a commitment, and a commitment has to be paid for with information. The whole arrangement rests on the corridor being as deep as the chart says, and the corridor's depth is a measurement taken on a specific day by a survey ship, applied to a seabed that is demonstrably capable of building 9 feet of new sand in 3 years, in a place where the resurvey interval had to be shortened because the last set of numbers had gone stale faster than anyone expected. The ship in the corridor knows none of this in real time. She has an echo sounder, which tells her the depth beneath her keel at the moment she is over it, which is roughly as useful as a car having a sensor that tells you what you just hit. That is what a modern megaship is actually doing in the Dover Strait. She's executing a plan built from information that was true when it was gathered. In a corridor she cannot leave, at a speed she cannot easily change, surrounded by traffic that has its own ideas. And every so often, one of the inputs to that plan is wrong. So let me take you to a small chemical tanker, a route drawn on a screen, and one of the more instructive nights in the modern history of this strait. The Ovid was not a megaship. She was a Malta-registered oil and chemical tanker, built in 2011, about 384 feet long, 6,444 gross tons, small, modern, unremarkable. The sort of ship that does the actual daily work of European trade and that nobody has ever heard of. In September of 2013, she loaded 9,500 metric tons of vegetable oil at Rotterdam and sailed for Brindisi, in the heel of Italy. 14 crew aboard, all Turkish. And I want to tell you about those 14 people before I tell you what happened, because the report on this accident does something that most accident reports don't, which is that it lets you see the human weather on board. Morale was low. Several of the crew had expected to be relieved during recent port calls, including Hamburg on the 14th of September, 4 days before, and the crew changes had been canceled. A delivery of cigarettes that had been promised at Hamburg didn't arrive either. That detail is in the official report of a grounding investigation, and it's there because the investigators understood that it mattered. If you have never worked at sea, that might read as trivial. If you have, you'll recognize it instantly. On a small ship on a long contract, the reliefs and the small comforts are the entire architecture of morale, and when they both fall through in the same port, the ship carries it. The master was 35. He'd been aboard 3 months, had been at sea for 15 years, and had held his master's certificate for 8. Ovid was the first ship he'd commanded where the electronic chart system was the primary means of navigation, with no paper charts as the working reference. He'd been through the required training courses, including bridge resource management 6 months earlier, and he'd done the type-specific course on the exact electronic chart system fitted to his ship. There's a line in the report about that course that I've thought about more than almost anything else in the file. The training sessions mix senior and junior officers together, with wildly different amounts of experience in the room, and the master was uncomfortable doing the course alongside junior officers. He found it embarrassing to ask questions. A man in his mid-30s, in command of a ship, sitting in a classroom next to people who report to him, not asking the question he needs answered because of how it would look. That is not a maritime problem. That is a human one. And if you have ever sat in a meeting and not asked the obvious question because you were the senior person in the room, you have made exactly the same decision, in a job where the consequences were an awkward silence rather than a ship on a sandbank. The chief officer was 27, 2 months aboard, on his first contract in that rank with 5 years at sea. The second officer was also 27, aboard just over 6 months. He was the ship's designated navigator. He was also the one who'd expected to leave at Hamburg and hadn't, and the report describes him as disappointed and demotivated by having to extend. The third officer had been aboard 5 months. This was his first contract since qualifying. Before that, he'd spent 4 years as a deck rating and 7 months as a cadet, and he was expecting to be promoted to second officer as soon as the second officer finally got off. And the deck cadet, 6 months aboard, qualified to stand a watch as bridge lookout, routinely working alongside the chief officer. Now watch how the passage plan got made, because everything that followed was decided here, days before anybody was in any danger. The second officer was the navigator. That was his job in writing. But the master, quite reasonably, looked at the situation and saw that the second officer was about to leave, and the third officer was about to inherit the role. So he told the third officer to plan the passage from Rotterdam to Brindisi. Give the man the practice while there's still somebody senior aboard to help. I want to be fair to that decision, because the investigators were. They called it reasonable. It's how people learn. Nobody becomes competent at passage planning by watching somebody else do it. The problem was everything that didn't happen next. There was no formal handover of the navigator's responsibilities, so the second officer was still, technically and actually, the navigating officer. He was the man with the experience and the job title, and he didn't assist, or advise, or check, or look over the third officer's shoulder. The investigators used the word astonishing about that, which is close to profanity in the register these reports are written in. The master didn't check the route either, not before departure, not at any point. And the passage plan the third officer produced ran, on one leg through the Dover Strait, directly over the Varne Bank. Straight over the top of it. A line on a screen from a waypoint to a waypoint, across a sandbank with 6.5 feet of water on it. How does that happen? The report explains the method, and it's the most ordinary thing imaginable. The third officer had gone through the route leg by leg, zooming in on the electronic chart to look for hazards visually, eyeballing it. And the investigators noted mildly that this very basic approach was unlikely to identify all the dangers, and that the system's own check route function, which exists precisely to do this automatically and which was sitting right there, would have been more accurate and more reliable. They also noted, and this is the part that stings, that even with the crude visual method, the danger of passing over the Varne should have been perfectly obvious if the check had been done carefully. So the ship sailed from Rotterdam with a course laid across one of the best-known sandbanks in Europe, drawn by the least experienced navigator aboard, unchecked by the man whose job it was, and unchecked by the man in command. On a ship where every officer had been trained on the equipment, and where the equipment could have caught it in about 4 seconds. She came down the strait on the night of the 17th into the 18th of September, in a southwesterly force 3 to 4, moderate sea. Good visibility. Good visibility. Remember that. This wasn't fog. At 2:30 in the morning, the chief officer came up to take the watch, and the deck cadet came with him as lookout. The ship was on autopilot, steering 206 degrees, doing 12 or 13 knots. The chief officer did the first thing anyone does on taking over a watch. He set up his displays the way he likes them. He put the electronic chart onto a scale that matched the range he had set on the radar next to it, 12 nautical miles, so that the two pictures would agree with each other. Then he sat down in the port bridge chair, which has a clear view of both screens. It's a completely rational thing to do. Matching your chart scale to your radar range means you're looking at the same slice of the world twice, once as a chart and once as an echo. And any experienced watchkeeper will tell you that's a good habit. The scale it produced was about 1 to 150,000. At that scale, on that system, the electronic chart stops displaying the detail that keeps you alive. The cardinal buoys, the depth contours, the shape of a sandbank. All of it either vanishes or shrinks to nothing. And the system knew it was displaying what the industry nicknames jail bars, a pattern of vertical lines across the screen that means you have zoomed out beyond the scale the underlying chart data was compiled for, and you are no longer being shown everything. The report notes dryly that the chief officer could not have avoided seeing them. At around 3 in the morning, the heading was adjusted to 225 degrees. At about 10 to 3, and again at 17 minutes past 4, Ovid crossed her own safety contour. The depth line the ship's system was supposed to treat as the boundary of safe water. On a properly configured system, that's a significant event. On this one, with the settings it had, crossing the safety contour had become a routine occurrence that happened all the time and that everybody had stopped noticing. Meanwhile, on the starboard side of the bridge, the deck cadet had his binoculars up and saw flashing white lights ahead. He didn't identify them, and he didn't report them. Those lights were the cardinal buoys marking the ends of the Varne Bank. The investigators later reconstructed the passage and worked out that the east and west cardinal marks would have become visible about 5 miles out, which means they were in sight roughly 25 minutes before the grounding. 25 minutes is an enormous amount of time at sea. It's enough to identify the buoys, work out what they mean, discover the error in the passage plan, alter course, and go on to Italy with a story about the night the plan turned out to be wrong. At 17 minutes past 4, the ship passed close by the Varn light float. From about 4:30, her speed began, very gently, to fall away. At 34 minutes past 4 in the morning, on the 18th of September, 2013, the Ovid stopped, because she was on the Varn Bank, in the middle of the Dover Strait traffic separation scheme, on a night of good visibility. With a full set of navigational marks around her and a working radar, and a trained officer sitting in a chair looking at both screens. Now let me take you ashore because the other half of this was happening at the same time in a room in Dover. At 11 minutes past 4, 23 minutes before the grounding, the Ovid's radar vector, the projection showing where she'd be in 6 minutes, crossed into the Coast Guard's Varn Bank alerting zone. This system exists for exactly this. It is a radar guard zone drawn around the sandbank, and it fires in 2 stages. Once, when a ship's vector enters the zone, and again when the ship herself does. An audible alarm went off in the operations room. The Ovid symbol on the display changed from black to red and started flashing, with the words approaching Varney next to it. The operator on the desk had 2 options on a drop-down menu. The first was Acknowledge, which silences the noise but leaves the symbol flashing red and lets the alarm fire again when the ship physically enters the zone. It's the option that says, "I've seen this, I'm watching it, keep reminding me." The second was Authorize, which silences the noise, turns the symbol back to black, stops the flashing, and suppresses the second stage entirely. It's the option that exists for a legitimate reason, because plenty of vessels are shallow enough to cross the Varn safely and are perfectly entitled to. It's the option that says, "This is fine. Stop telling me." The operator selected Authorize, and then went back to a radio conversation with a different ship. That's it. That's the whole failure. One drop-down menu, in a busy room, at 4 in the morning. I don't think you can look at that and put it on the person who clicked it, and I feel fairly strongly about this. Look at the design. 2 buttons sit next to each other. One of them is cautious and keeps the problem alive. The other one is final and makes the problem disappear. They are equally easy to press. And the room they sit in is a room where alarms go off constantly, all night, most of them for situations that turn out to be nothing. Anybody who has worked in a hospital knows exactly where this goes. Alarm fatigue is a documented, studied, thoroughly understood phenomenon in intensive care, where the monitors are so sensitive and so numerous that staff become desensitized to them, and the industry has spent decades trying to design its way out of it. The problem was never that the nurses didn't care. The problem was that a signal, which is almost always noise, stops functioning as a signal, no matter how much the person receiving it cares. Put the same physiology in a maritime operations room, and you get a button that makes it quiet. And the arrangements around that button were not what they should have been. The procedure for what to do when the Varn alarm fires had been circulated to watch officers by email, 5 months earlier, by the manager. It had never been written into the station's formal procedures. The training scheme that qualified people to operate the service, which is a serious and detailed scheme, contained no specific requirement for training on the Varn Bank alerting system at all. Then there's who was actually in the room. That watch consisted of a watch manager, a watch officer, 2 trainee watch officers, one of them borrowed from a different watch, and a watch assistant. Only 3 of them were qualified operators, because the senior watch manager and a part-time watch officer were both on leave, At the moment the Ovid was approaching the Varn, the watch manager and the watch officer were both out of the operations room, on a meal break, which they were entitled to and had to take, because human beings on a 12-hour night shift have to eat. That left 3 people covering the 4 functions. The watch assistant was running the sunk traffic service in the North Sea. 1 trainee watch officer was on the distress frequency and search and rescue, and the other trainee watch officer was running the channel navigation information service alone, watching the busiest strait on Earth. Nobody had been nominated to be in charge while the manager was away. So when the alarm went off and the drop-down menu appeared, the person looking at it was an unqualified trainee, unsupervised, in the middle of a radio conversation with another vessel, in a room at minimum manning. The report's phrasing is careful, and I'll give it to you straight. The procedure, which should have alerted the tanker's officer of the watch as she approached the bank, was not followed, because the procedure had not been formalized, and an unqualified and unsupervised operator was distracted. Every word in that sentence is doing work, and not one of those words is a criticism of the individual. Here's what happened on the bridge after the ship stopped, and it's the part that has stayed with me longest. The chief officer didn't know he'd grounded. 3 minutes after the ship came to a halt, an engineering alarm went off. He put both propulsion control levers to 0, telephoned the master in his cabin to tell him about the alarm, and telephoned the second engineer to get somebody to look at the engines. He had a ship that had stopped in the water in the middle of a traffic separation scheme, and his working theory was a machinery breakdown. 9 minutes later, the second engineer called back to say that 45 degrees of a head pitch was available on the starboard unit. So the chief officer applied it. The ship stayed exactly where she was, which he took as confirmation that the engines were still broken. He was, at that moment, trying to drive a grounded tanker off a sandbank while believing he was testing a propulsion fault. And then, Dover called. The transcript is in the report, and it's one of the strangest short conversations you'll ever read, because 2 people are talking past each other with perfect politeness while one of them has information the other one badly needs. The Coast Guard operator asks if everything's all right on board, because according to their radar, he may be on the Varn bank. The reply comes back that there's an engine breakdown problem, but it'll probably be fine in 5 minutes. The operator, who is clearly getting somewhere in his own mind, asks what the current depth of water is. There's a pause. Then, my present draft is 7.9 meters, 26 feet of ship below the waterline. Not the question. The operator tries again, and you can hear him simplifying, the way you do when you suspect the words aren't landing. Negative, sir. What is the underkeel clearance? Another pause. Longer. It's approximately 10 meters, the underkeel clearance. The ship is sitting on a sandbank. The officer on her bridge has just told the shore, in good faith, that he has 33 feet of water under him. The conversation carries on for another minute or so, about the nature of the engine difficulty, about the azimuth propellers, about how long the repairs will take. 10 minutes, he thinks. The operator asks him to call back in 10 minutes and the exchange ends, and neither man knows what has actually happened. At about 7 minutes to 5, the chief officer zoomed in on the electronic chart and saw. 19 minutes after the ship grounded, on a clear night with a working chart system in the world's most closely monitored waterway, an officer discovered his own grounding by changing the zoom level on a screen. The rest is anticlimax, and thank God for that. The master came up. Ballast tanks were sounded for leaks, and there weren't any. Somebody walked around the deck looking for pollution, and there wasn't any. A second radio conversation with Dover, at about 7 minutes past 5, finally established the truth, and even then it arrived sideways, with the words, "Now the speed over the ground is 0. And yes, there is a possibility of a grounding." Then everybody waited for the tide. That morning at Dover, low water was predicted for 7 minutes past 5 at 1.1 meters, and high water for 1 minute past 10 at 6.7. In feet, that is a range running from 3.5 up to 22. The tanker had grounded on a height of tide of 1.4 meters, 4.5 feet falling. She lifted off between 16 and 22 minutes past 7, on 4.2 meters, close to 14 feet, rising. The channel put her on, and about 3 hours later the channel took her off. She went into Dover for divers to look at her, and they found she'd lost a lot of hull coating on the starboard side below the bilge keel and nothing worse. No injuries. No pollution. 9,500 metric tons of vegetable oil still exactly where it was supposed to be. A port state control surveyor came aboard and detained her until her seaworthiness could be assessed and one specific defect fixed: the electronic chart system's audible alarm, which had not been working. A service engineer came down, called the manufacturer's support line for advice, and repaired it. Now, if this were a single strange night, it would be a curiosity. It isn't. On the 26th of April, 2006, the bulk carrier Lowlands Maine ran aground on the Varn Bank. She drifted off her track. The chief officer had altered course to get back onto it, and the new course pointed straight at the bank. Then the watch changed. The third officer came up, fixed the position, saw that the ship had regained her track, and left the heading exactly where it was. She kept going toward the Varn until she hit it. On the 2nd of January, 2008, the container ship LT Cortesia ran aground on the Varn Bank, buckling an internal bulkhead. The German investigators concluded that the officer of the watch hadn't properly assessed the shipping situation, that communication with the lookout was ineffective, and that the contour and alarm settings on the electronic chart system were inappropriate. 2006, 2008, 2013. 3 groundings on the same sandbank in 7 years, by 3 different ships of 3 different types under 3 different flags, in the most heavily supervised strait on the planet, in an era when every one of them had satellite positioning accurate to a few yards. That's the pattern. And the pattern is what tells you where the fear in this story actually lives. Because none of these ships got lost. Not one of them had any doubt whatsoever about where she was. Satellite positioning had solved that problem completely by the 1990s, and every one of these bridges knew its own position to within a few yards continuously. What they didn't know was what was underneath the position. Read the chief inspector's foreword to the Ovid report, and you can hear a man choosing his words with some care. He points out that this was the 3rd grounding his branch had investigated, where failure to use the electronic chart system properly was one of the causal factors. He notes that at the time of publication, there were over 30 manufacturers of these systems, each with their own interface design, and little sign that a common approach was emerging. Generic training is mandated internationally. Whether you also get trained on the specific system fitted to your specific ship is left to flag states and owners to decide. And then the sentence that does the real damage. The current generation of these systems, though certified as complying with the regulations, can be operated at a very low level of functionality, with key safety features disabled or circumvented. Training and company culture can mitigate that to some extent, but only so far. While systems allow individuals to operate them in a substandard manner, there are those who will do so, because such is human nature. That is a senior accident investigator saying, in public, that the equipment on which modern navigation depends is designed in a way that permits it to be used badly, and that permission will be taken. And now hold that next to the deep water route, and the sand waves, and the 21 feet of allowance, and the tide in mid-strait that can be 3 feet lower than the book says. Every single one of the ship's defenses against the seabed of the Dover Strait is a piece of information. The chart. The survey behind the chart. The plan drawn on the chart. The settings on the display showing the plan. The alarm configured against the settings. The shore radar watching the whole thing. And the person at the shore radar? and the menu that person is looking at. Not one of those defenses is physical. There's nothing out there stopping a ship from going where she shouldn't. The Varn is marked with 4 buoys, and the buoys are information too. Now let me give you the other kind of accident. The one where the seabed has nothing to do with it, and the outcome is decided entirely by 2 men who could see each other perfectly the entire time. The 1st of July, 2017. A clear night, good visibility, about 5 nautical miles west of the Sandetti Bank. The oil tanker Sea Frontier had sailed from Antwerp the previous afternoon with 37,944 metric tons of gasoline aboard, bound for Lagos. Hong Kong flag, Canadian management. 27 crew, all Indian, working in English. Her master was 36, had 5 years in command, and this was his first contract on this ship and his first ever transit of the Dover Strait. Coming down the same lane behind her was the bulk carrier Hwayang Endeavour, out of Amsterdam in ballast for Colombia. Also Hong Kong flag, Chinese management, Chinese crew, working languages Mandarin and English. Her master was 43, had 3 years in command, and had made the Dover Strait passage several times. At 2 in the morning, Hwayang Endeavour was in the southwest lane doing 15.5 knots with the engine on full ahead. On her bridge, the master, who had the con, the second officer, and 1 able seaman. The master had set the second officer to gathering the information for the mandatory report to the Coast Guard. The able seaman, who was the lookout, had been allowed to go down to the galley to make a snack. So at that moment, on a large ship at 15.5 knots in the busiest strait in the world, the entire watch was 1 man at the radar and 1 man doing paperwork. He was doing his collision avoidance off the starboard radar, dealing with each situation as it came to him. What he wasn't doing, and the investigators are specific about this, was long-range scanning. The collision regulations require it. You are supposed to look out to the edge of your radar picture and understand the shape of the traffic ahead of you long before any of it becomes a problem, so that you can make one early, obvious, generous alteration instead of a series of late ones. He was overtaking a lot of people. At 16 knots, he was faster than most of the lane, and the record shows him making adjustment after adjustment all the way down, threading through. Ahead of him, Sea Frontier crossed into the southwest lane at 10 past 2 at a shallow angle, exactly as the rules allow, and settled onto 221 degrees. She had her own problem. A small vessel called Donau Express the Coup. Crossing ahead of her from starboard, close. Now look at the geometry, because everything follows from it. 2 ships in the same lane, on courses 1 degree apart, 1 doing 16 knots, and 1 doing 12.5, 3 miles apart, converging. It's the slowest possible emergency. It develops over 45 minutes. At 24 minutes past 2, Sea Frontier picked up the bulk carrier on radar and started tracking her. Her master had assessed the situation early and correctly, and he had reached a firm conclusion: the ship behind is overtaking me. Therefore, the ship behind must keep clear of me. Which is the rule? On the other bridge, nobody had properly registered the developing picture until the second officer looked up at about 10 to 3 and told the master that the closest point of approach with Sea Frontier was under 3/10 of a mile, which was below the half-mile limit the master had written into his own standing orders. By then, the 2 ships were about a mile apart. There's a moment here that I find almost unbearable, and it involves neither ship. Twice, at about 20 past 2, Hwayang Endeavour's second officer called Dover Coast Guard on the radio to file the mandatory report, and twice the watch officer told him he wasn't in the reporting area yet, and to call back at the Mid-Falls buoy. Perfectly correct, entirely by the book. And it means that in the 45 minutes when this was developing, the traffic organization and the 2 ships were transacting administrative business. At about 7 minutes to 3 with a mile to run, the master of Hwayang Endeavour told his second officer to get on the radio and find out what the tanker intended. I'm going to give you the conversation almost in full because it lasts 90 seconds and it kills a ship's accommodation block. Huayang Endeavor calls. Sea Frontier answers. They switch to a working channel. And then, Sea Frontier, what is your intention? The reply comes back with an edge on it. I should ask you what is your intention? You are overtaking me and not keeping me clear. What is your intention? Huayang Endeavor, I will overtake you on your starboard side. Starboard side. Okay? And now the sentence the whole accident turns on. The tanker's master says, alter your course to starboard side. I have a vessel on my port side. I cannot alter so much on my port side. I am giving some few degrees to my port side. I will give you some 4 or 5 degrees clearance, but I cannot alter too much on my port side, okay? Read that as a native speaker, and it's clear enough. He's saying, go round my starboard side, I'll edge a little to port to open the gap for you. The reply is, yeah, error. Port overtake is so near, is very dangerous. Then Sea Frontier again. No, you have to keep me clear, because you are overtaking me. You can reduce your speed, do you understand? And Huayang Endeavor. Yeah, okay, thank you. Yeah, okay, thank you. 2 bridge teams. On a clear night, half a mile apart, in a language that is the first language of neither of them, on a radio, hang up believing 2 different and incompatible things. The master of Huayang Endeavor had not listened to the call. He had the con, and as it turned out, he understood English considerably better than his second officer did, and he stood there while the conversation happened and let it happen. Afterwards, the second officer summarized it for him in Mandarin, and the summary he gave was that the tanker did not want to be overtaken on her starboard side, which is the opposite of what the tanker had said. So the master of Huayang Endeavor made a decision that was entirely logical, given what he'd been told, and entirely wrong. At about 4 minutes to 3, at just under 7/10 of a mile, he put the helm hard to port to go down the tanker's port side instead. He did it as a series of small alterations over 3 minutes, swinging gradually onto about 170 degrees. He made no sound signal. And on Sea Frontier's bridge, nobody noticed. A large ship changing heading slowly at night, showing you her stern light, does not announce herself. Meanwhile, the tanker's master had his own problem getting worse. The lane narrows near the South Falls buoy. The small vessel was still there, fine on his port bow, and he was running out of room. He came down to dead slow ahead. And then he made his own decision, based on his own understanding of that radio call. He believed the bulk carrier was going down his starboard side, so the safest way to get clear of the small vessel was to take a full turn to port and come all the way round. At 6 seconds past 2:59, he ordered the helm hard to port. Huayang Endeavor was 4/10 of a mile off his port quarter, in the exact water he was turning into. Nobody looked astern. No sound signal was made. A minute later, his second officer called Dover Coast Guard and said, "We are just turning our vessel right around for the traffic ahead of us, and we will come back on our course again." And the watch officer at Dover, watching this on radar in real time, came back with a sentence that has the sound of a man sitting forward in his chair. "Can you explain exactly what are you doing, sir? You have traffic coming to the stern of you, coming behind you down the southwest lane." "Yes, sir," said the tanker. "We will go astern of the vessel overtaking us." "Have you called that vessel? Have you made your intentions clear to him?" That is the entire tragedy of the Dover Strait compressed into 2 radio questions, asked by a man ashore who could see both ships and had no power over either of them. On the tanker's bridge, while that radio call was still going on, the able seaman on lookout decided on his own initiative to walk over to the port side and check astern. Good man. He is the only person in this entire sequence who does the simple physical thing. And he was startled, which is the report's word, to find the bulk carrier on the port quarter with her green side light showing clearly, which means her starboard side was turned toward him, which means she was swinging across into his water, he shouted. At the same moment, the second officer questioned whether the master really meant to complete a full turn with a ship right behind them. The master came and looked and was alarmed. He stopped the swing, dropped the engine to dead slow, and the second officer urged him to alter to starboard. Without acknowledging him, the master ordered the helm 10 degrees to starboard, then hard to starboard, and increased power to speed up the turn, and told the second officer to work the signaling lamp at the other ship. The lamp was never seen. Over on Huayang Endeavor, the master, watching from the bridge window, was equally alarmed to see the tanker swinging fast to port and across his bow. When she steadied on a heading of 172 degrees, the two ships were a little over 700 yards apart, at their closing speed less than a minute and a half. And here is where you see what a large ship really is. At around 1 minute past 3, the master of the bulk carrier ordered the helm hard to starboard. Then, as the distance kept closing, he changed his mind and ordered hard to port. Then he changed his mind again and ordered hard to starboard. I don't say that to mock him. I say it because it is exactly what the situation does to a person. He had a ship he could not stop, a rule book that said one thing, a radio conversation that had said another, and a tanker full of gasoline coming across his bow, and he had roughly 90 seconds. Anybody who has ever frozen for 2 seconds on a motorway knows the shape of it. He had a motorway moment, and his vehicle was hundreds of feet long and weighed tens of thousands of metric tons. At about 4 minutes past 3, less than 2 ship lengths apart, he pulled the engine back through slow ahead, dead slow ahead, and stop in quick succession. 2 ship lengths. That's your braking distance. And it isn't a braking distance at all. At that range, a ship of that size will still be doing most of her speed when she arrives. On the tanker, the master went to dead slow astern, and 5 seconds before impact, the second officer reached past him and put the telegraph to emergency astern. 5 seconds. The bulk carrier's starboard bow struck the tanker's port side into the accommodation block, the part of the ship where people live. Now, the good news, and it really is good news, nobody was hurt. There was no pollution. Nearly 38,000 metric tons of gasoline stayed inside the tanker because the damage was above the waterline and because modern tankers are built the way they are, for exactly this reason. The damage, though, tells you what the energy was. The tanker's accommodation was wrecked over 5 decks. The port rescue boat and its davit were destroyed outright. A whole set of external stairs was simply removed from the side of the ship. The bulk carrier's bow was punched through into her forecastle store and a forward void space, and her starboard plating was indented along its entire length. The two ships stayed locked together for about an hour while people inspected the damage and then did further damage to each other separating. A Coast Guard helicopter was launched to watch. The bulk carrier went into Dunkirk and the tanker went back to Antwerp, and neither of them needed help to get there. So, why did it happen? The investigators identified fatigue, and the detail is worth having exactly. The tanker's master had been on his bridge continuously from the moment they left Antwerp until the moment of the collision, slightly more than 14 hours. Under the International Labor Convention that governs seafarers' hours, 14 hours is the maximum permissible period between rest periods. He was not in breach. He was precisely at the legal limit, with a straight still to finish and no prospect of getting off the bridge until his ship was clear of congested water. It was his first ever transit of the Dover Strait as master. He was crossing traffic lanes at night in the busiest waterway on Earth for the first time. At the end of the longest stretch, he was legally allowed to work. And the report notes something quietly damning about that. There were enough senior deck officers aboard for him to have arranged a rota. His own company's safety management system explicitly provided for the chief officer to relieve him so that rest hours could be met. The option existed. He didn't take it. And I suspect most people in command would have made the same choice, because handing your bridge to someone else in difficult water feels like abdication, even when the alternative is doing it tired. Then, there's the radio. The investigators are careful here. Using the radio to establish whether a risk of collision exists is generally accepted, and with the automatic identification system now telling you the name of every ship on your screen, the old problem of not knowing who you were calling has largely gone away. Watchkeepers use it more and more. But in this case, it was used to try to resolve a close-quarters situation when the ships were already less than a mile apart. There was no time. The language was imprecise. And there is a standard vocabulary for exactly this, the standard marine communication phrases. Taught under the International Training Convention. Designed to strip ambiguity out of exchanges between people who don't share a first language. Neither ship used it. The conclusion is one sentence, and it applies to a great deal more than shipping. The two bridge teams developed conflicting plans while believing that they understood the intentions of the other. I said earlier that fog produces collisions by destroying the shared picture. Here is the same failure with the visibility good. The radars working, the ships in plain sight of each other, and both crews acting in good faith. The picture was destroyed by a conversation. That, I think, is the thing that makes experienced mariners uneasy about the Dover Strait in a way that the depth never quite does. The lanes solved the geometry. They did not, and could not, solve the problem of what happens inside two skulls a mile apart at 3 in the morning. And notice where it happened, 5 miles west of the Sandier Bank, at the narrowing by the South Falls, in the same few square miles of water where the deep water route runs, and the sand waves move. The tanker's master turned to port because the lane was narrowing and a small ship was in his way. The lane narrows there because of what's on the bottom. The two threads had been running side by side all night, and that's where they touched. There's a third thing this water does, and it belongs to the Western Channel rather than the Strait, and it's the one that tests the ship herself. On the morning of the 18th of January, 2007, the container ship MSC Napoli was on passage in the English Channel. 4,419 containers capacity. Not a giant even by the standards of the day, and about a fifth the size of the largest ships afloat now. It was rough. Waves up to 9 meters, which is around 30 feet, and she was pitching heavily into them at 11 knots. Now, 30-foot seas in the channel in January is weather, and it is not exceptional weather. Ships work through it constantly. The channel is a funnel with the Atlantic at the wide end, and when a deep low tracks across the approaches, the swell it generates has hundreds of miles of open water to organize itself before it arrives, and then it runs into shoaling water and gets steeper and shorter, which is exactly the condition that hurts a long ship. A vessel of that length in seas of that length spends her time with her bow, and stern supported and her middle unsupported. Then the reverse, over and over, thousands of times a day. The hull is a very long beam being bent up and down. That's ordinary. That's what hulls are designed for. At about 11:05 in the morning, hers stopped being able to do it. The report calls it a catastrophic failure of the hull in way of the engine room. The structure gave way, and the engine room flooded, and a ship that had been a ship 20 minutes earlier was now a very large object with water inside it and no power. The master's response is worth pausing on, because in a story full of decisions that turned out badly, this is one that was made fast and made right. He assessed the situation, concluded she was going to be lost, and decided to abandon. A distress call went out at 11:25. All 26 crew got into an enclosed lifeboat and got clear, and 2 Royal Navy helicopters picked them up. No injuries. Not one. That is a fully successful abandonment from a broken ship in 30-foot seas in January, and it happened because the equipment worked and the drills had been done and the man in charge, Boichian, did not spend an hour hoping. The wreck was taken in tow toward Portland, and as she came in toward the English coast, it became clear she might break up or sink where she was. So a deliberate decision was taken to put her on the beach, and on the 20th of January, she was intentionally grounded in Branscombe Bay in Devon. She listed heavily, and a number of containers went over the side, and their contents came ashore, and for a fortnight the coast of Devon became a national news story about beachcombing. The part of the Napoli story that matters most, though, is the report. The investigators found that the hull did not have sufficient buckling strength in the region of the engine room. The classification rules in force when she was built did not require buckling strength calculations to be carried out beyond the midships area of the ship, which means nobody had ever been required to check the specific place where she failed. There was no adequate safety margin between the loads the hull was designed for and the loads at which it would actually give way. The forces were probably increased by whipping, which is the vibration set up in a long hull when the bow slams into a wave, a shudder that runs through the whole structure and adds its own stresses on top of the bending. And the ship's speed had not been reduced enough for the conditions. Then the investigators did something that turns this from an accident report into something much more serious. They looked at their own finding and asked the obvious question. If the rules didn't require anybody to check that part of the structure, how many other ships are out there? They asked the major classification societies to screen container ship designs urgently. Over 1,500 ships were checked. 12 were identified as needing remedial work. Another 10 were borderline and needed a closer look, and 8 more were still being assessed when the report went to print. 12 ships out of 1,500 is a small number and a reassuring one. It's also 12 ships that were, at the time of the Napoli's failure, sailing around the world with a structural weakness nobody had been asked to look for. I want to be scrupulous here, because it would be easy and dishonest to fold this into a story about the English Channel eating ships. The Napoli's problem came aboard with her at the shipyard. She could have failed anywhere she met heavy weather. The Channel didn't cause it. What the Channel did was set the terms of the consequence. A ship that fails in the middle of an ocean is a search and rescue problem and, in the worst case, a loss. A ship that fails in the English Channel is all of that plus a navigational hazard in dense traffic, plus a pollution threat to 2 of the most heavily used coastlines in Europe, plus a salvage operation conducted in front of the world's press, plus a stretch of national park with containers on it. And that is the structural fact about this waterway that never changes. Everything that happens here happens close to somebody. There is no offshore in the English Channel. The whole thing is inshore. There's a version of the same lesson in the underkeel arithmetic we did earlier, and I'd like to close this loop properly. Remember that the guidance tells masters to allow for the effects of waves and swell resulting from local and distant storms. That's the Napoli's weather in a different guise. The same 30-foot sea that bends a hull also means a ship isn't sitting at a fixed draft. She's oscillating, and the deepest point of that oscillation is what the seabed sees. So on a rough day in the Western Channel, a ship is being bent by the swell. On the same rough day, in the shallow eastern end, that swell is quietly eating the margin between her keel and the sand. It's the same water doing both. So let's look at what this water does to a ship that has stopped moving. On the 20th of November, 2016, Storm Angus was working over the southeast of England, and out in the sheltered water inside the Goodwin Sands, a couple of miles off the Kent coast, ships were doing what ships have done off that coast for 800 years. They were anchored, waiting for it to blow through. That anchorage is one of the oldest in Europe. Sailing ships used it in their thousands, because the Goodwins take the worst of the sea out of an easterly and leave a patch of water where you can lie in some comfort while the weather does its business outside. It is, in every sense that mattered for most of maritime history, a good place to be. What has changed is what's underneath it. The seabed between England and France is now a piece of critical national infrastructure. There are 3 electricity interconnectors between the two countries carrying about 4 gigawatts in total. The oldest, known as IFA, was commissioned in 1986 and can move 2,000 megawatts. A second, IFA-2, came into service in January of 2021. A third, ELEC Link, went live in May of 2022 and runs through the Channel Tunnel itself, which is a solution of some elegance. On top of that, there are telecommunications cables and gas and everything else 2 adjacent industrial economies need to pass to each other. Cables like that are heavily armored and buried in the seabed. They are also, from the point of view of a ship's anchor in a storm, a set of steel ropes lying in the mud in a place where a very heavy hook is about to be dragged. That morning, at around 10 to 9, the general cargo ship Saga Sky collided with a rock-carrying barge called Stemma Barge de Purs. About 2 miles off the coast, both vessels had been affected by the weather, and 2 subsea power cables, part of the first interconnector, were severed. The investigation found 2 things that are worth having in your head together. The first concerns the barge. Her anchor had been laid directly above one of the cables. She was there because her passage planning had relied on charts that were out of date, and the picture of the seabed that everyone aboard was working from did not show what was actually there. The second concerns the cargo ship. As the situation developed, the Coast Guard prompted her several times to get her anchors down. Her anchors were not deployed until the moment at which deploying them might have prevented a collision had already passed. I've read that finding several times, and I still find it the most human line in the file. Nobody refused. Nobody was reckless. It was a fast-moving morning in a storm, and a decision that would have worked at 20 past 8 did not work at 10 to 9. And the difference between those 2 times is what the whole thing turned on. The consequences went a long way beyond the 2 ships. The national grid operator reported that 4 of the 8 cables making up the interconnector had been damaged, at a point about 3 miles off the English coast, and that the link's capacity was halved. The damage was described as extremely unusual, because these cables are armored and buried precisely so this cannot happen. At the time, the cause had not been formally identified, and the operator was careful to say so, though the collision and the storm were the obvious candidates, and the accident investigators subsequently attributed the severing of 2 of the cables to the incident. And then the investigators made recommendations to 5 separate organizations. Look at the list, because it's a map of everything this exposed. Emergency towing capability, regulatory powers over vessels anchoring near cables, improvements to marine licensing, minimum safe distances from cables, and shipboard procedures for heavy weather. 5 different institutions, none of which had done anything wrong exactly, all of which turned out to own a piece of a whole. The first item on that list is the one I want to finish this part on, because it is the clearest example in the whole story of ingenuity buying you something and then quietly sending you the bill. For 18 years, from 1993, Britain maintained a fleet of emergency towing vessels. Not salvage tugs in the commercial sense, waiting to negotiate a contract while a casualty drifts. Government-funded tugs, held on station, whose entire purpose was to get a line onto a ship that had lost power before that ship arrived somewhere expensive. By 2010, there were 4 of them: Anglian Prince, Anglian Princess, Anglian Sovereign, and Anglian Monarch. 2 covered the south coast of England, 1 at Falmouth in Cornwall for the western approaches, and 1 at Dover for the Strait. The other 2 were in Scotland, at Stornoway in the Outer Hebrides, and at Lerwick in Shetland. The Dover boat, Anglian Monarch, was jointly funded with France, which makes complete sense when you think about it, because a disabled ship in the Dover Strait is not a British problem or a French problem. It's a problem belonging to whichever coast the tide is setting toward that afternoon. In 2010, as part of the spending review, the government announced that the emergency towing vessel fleet would no longer be funded, with the arrangement ending in September of 2011 and a saving of £32.5 million over the review period. The tugs were repainted in their owners' colors and went back to commercial work. Now watch what France did. Faced with the end of the joint charter, the French authorities repositioned one of their own intervention and salvage tugs, the Abbaye Languedoc, to Boulogne-sur-Mer, with effect from the 1st of October 2011. She's chartered by the French Navy and works under the maritime prefect for the Channel and the North Sea, and her job is rescue, assistance to ships in difficulty, and anti-pollution response every day. She has since been succeeded in that role by a newer and more powerful vessel. The French take on the strait, in their own official language, is that the Pas de Calais is the first strait in the world by number of ships, and the second after Malacca by tonnage carried, with something like 90,000 vessels a year moving through the separation scheme in both directions, an average of about 250 a day. So the Dover Strait still has a dedicated emergency tug on standby. It sits on the French side, it flies a French flag, and it exists because France decided the risk was worth paying for after Britain decided it wasn't. I'll be blunt, because I don't think this is a close call. Removing a stationed emergency tug from the busiest strait in the world to save money is the kind of decision that looks clever for years and then looks appalling for one afternoon. The saving is certain and appears in a budget line. The cost is probabilistic and appears in a coastline. And when the accident investigators looked at a storm warning off Kent 5 years later, one of the 5 recommendations they made was about emergency towing capability in the Dover Strait, which is about as close as an accident investigation branch gets to saying "we told you so" in writing. You can see the shape of it now. Every element of the system that makes this strait safe is a piece of provision that somebody has to keep paying for. And the safer it makes things, the easier it becomes to argue that it isn't needed. The survey ship that goes back to the sand waves every 2 years. The 4 cardinal buoys on the Varne, which have to be maintained by a tender crew going out in a boat. The radar heads on the cliffs. The operations room with its minimum manning. The tug on standby at Boulogne. The hourly broadcast that doubles in frequency when the visibility drops. None of that produces anything. All of it exists to make sure that nothing happens. And the record of nothing happening is then produced as evidence that the fear was overblown. Which finally lets me answer the question properly. Ask a master of a 1,300-foot ship what frightens him about the Dover Strait, and he will talk to you about margin, not depth, not traffic. Margin. Margin is the stuff a ship uses to absorb other people's mistakes. It comes in 4 kinds, and every one of them is a resource that gets spent. There's water under the keel, which is margin against the bottom. There's sea room on either side, which is margin against other ships. There's time, which is margin against surprise. And there's the ability to change what the ship is doing, to slow down or speed up or turn, which is the margin that converts all the others into an actual escape. In open ocean, a large ship has all 4 in abundance. She has a mile of water beneath her, 100 miles of sea room, hours of warning, and complete freedom to do whatever she likes with her engine and her helm. In the Dover Strait, on a loaded deep draft passage, she has spent all 4 before anything has gone wrong. The water under her keel is a calculated figure made of a survey, a tide table, a squat estimate, and a swell allowance, and it may be down to a few yards. Her sea room is a lane, bounded by a separation zone she is not supposed to enter and shoal water. She cannot enter in a corridor she was directed into precisely because she draws too much to go anywhere else. Her time is compressed by traffic that develops around her continuously and by crossing ships that appear at right angles on a schedule. And her freedom to maneuver is the smallest of all, because a ship of that size takes miles to stop and cannot turn hard without losing the steering that turning depends on. That is the fear, stated as plainly as I can put it. A modern megaship in the English Channel is operating with every one of her margins already committed, and she is doing it in company with several hundred vessels, any one of which can make an ordinary human error at any moment. What he's afraid of is arriving at a minute where the only options remaining are bad ones, and worse, of arriving there without knowing it. That second half is the part that the evidence really supports, and it's why I think the fear is proportionate rather than dramatic. Go back through what we've looked at. On the Ovid, an officer sat in a chair on a clear night for 2 hours with a correct position, a working radar, and a working chart display, and did not know his ship was heading for a sandbank, and then did not know she was on it for 19 minutes after she stopped. On the Sea Frontier, a master at the legal limit of his working hours put his helm hard over into water occupied by a ship he believed was somewhere else, having just had a conversation with her about it. In a Dover operations room, an alarm designed to catch exactly this fired 23 minutes before a grounding and was answered correctly by the standards of a procedure that had only ever been circulated in an email, by an unqualified trainee working alone, while 2 qualified colleagues were eating. Off the Kent coast in a storm, a barge lay at anchor on top of a power cable because the charts in use didn't show it there. Not one of those people was incompetent, and not one of them was unlucky in any meaningful sense. Every one of them was inside a system that had, in that particular corner, run out of margin, and none of them could see it at the time. Now put the ship's size back into it, because the megaship part of this is more precise than people usually assume. The strait has not got more dangerous. That's the finding the collision statistics actually support, and I'd rather be accurate than exciting. Crossing traffic has not exploded since the 1970s. The collision rate has not run away. The scheme has held for more than 50 years. What's happened is that the ships have grown into the strait's limits. The Dover Strait is exactly as wide, exactly as deep, and exactly as tidal as it was when the first traffic separation scheme was drawn on a chart in 1967. 20 miles across at the pinch, 150 feet deep on average, a sandbank with 6 feet of water on it sitting in the traffic. Those numbers are fixed for the rest of human history, and into that unchanged geography we have introduced ships 1,300 feet long, 200 feet wide, drawing 75 feet, carrying 250,000 metric tons, run by crews of 20-odd people on watch systems that never allow a full night's sleep, navigating on chart systems with 30 different interfaces and no common training standard, in a place where the seabed can build 9 feet of sand in 3 years. Every increase in ship size has been paid for out of the margins. The width of the strait was never available to pay with. The bill came out of the water under the keel, the sea room in the lane, the time available to react, and the ability to do anything about it. That's why the fear is proportionate. It has little to do with the channel destroying a ship, because in the ordinary course of events it very obviously doesn't. It's a professional's understanding that the safety of the passage is now assembled almost entirely out of things that have to be right in advance and cannot be corrected on the day. The survey has to be current, the plan has to be checked, the settings have to be sensible, the alarm has to work, and somebody has to be watching it. The other ship's master has to be rested, and has to have understood the radio, and has to be looking astern before he turns. Get all of that right, and the passage is so uneventful that people on the cliffs at Dover watch it happen while eating chips and never think about it once. Get one of them wrong, and the strait does not give you a second chance, because the second chance is made of margin, and the margin is gone. Which leaves one last thing to say about the low casualty numbers, and I'll say it once. They are not evidence that the fear is misplaced. They are the product of the fear. Everything that keeps this water safe was built by people who were frightened by something specific and did something about it, and the chain of it is unbroken from the beginning. 3 ships lost off the Varn in 7 weeks in 1971 produced a mandatory routing system for the entire world. A tanker on a sandbank in 2013 produced changes to how navigational inspections are done and to how an operations room is staffed. A container ship breaking her back in 2007 produced a screening program that found 12 other vessels with the same weakness before it found them the hard way. A collision in a storm off Kent produced recommendations to 5 organizations about cables and anchors and tugs. Every one of those is a case of somebody being properly afraid and converting it into infrastructure. So here's where I'd like to leave you, and it isn't at sea. It's in 2 rooms, one on a clifftop at Dover, one on the headland at Cap Grisnez, 20-odd miles apart, both of them lit up right now tonight while you're watching this. Screens with several hundred moving symbols on them, each symbol a ship with a name and a course and a draft. A handful of people on shift, drinking bad coffee, watching the busiest strait on Earth move through itself hour after hour, waiting for the one symbol that starts behaving strangely. They have been doing that continuously since 1972. Through every storm, every Christmas, every night, 2 countries splitting the job down the middle of the water, one taking the ships going up, the other taking the ships coming down. Nothing is going to happen tonight. That's the whole point of them. And that brings me to the thing I actually want from you, which has nothing to do with ships. Somewhere in your working life there is an alarm that everybody silences, a warning that fires so often it has stopped meaning anything. A check that's technically somebody's job and practically nobody's. A procedure that lives in an email instead of in the manual. Every industry has them, and most of the time they cost nothing at all. Right up until the morning they cost everything. I'd like to hear about yours. Drop it in the comments, as specific as you're willing to be. What's the button in your job that makes the problem quiet? The ones that come in from people who work in aviation, medicine, rail, power, and yes, at sea, are consistently the ones I end up reading twice. And if you want more of this sort of thing, the kind where we go and read the actual report instead of repeating the headline, then subscribe. Because that's the whole plan around here. A like helps more than you'd think, for reasons involving a recommendation system that is at least as opaque as the seabed of the Dover Strait. Go carefully out there.